Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And what we're going to discuss in this section is culture shock, Star Wars, Argonauts of the Western Pacific, and the Great Kula Ring. We're going to talk about a fellow whose name is just as much fun to spell as it is to say. We are going to talk about an entirely new actor. We're going to talk about Bronislaw Malinowski, the enemy alien of anthropology. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head. And this lecture is going to serve as an introduction to how Bronislaw Malinowski invents an entirely novel way to study human culture. Now, again, within cultural anthropology, there exists considerable difference on the best way to study human culture, but broadly, you can kind of define anthropology's approach to human culture in three very broad categories: the Boasians, the structure function guys, and postmodern anthropology. We've already covered the Boasians, where you sort of study as a student of the culture, you learn from the people of the culture, they teach you the culture, then you write this really big, fat description of the culture, and then you offer a psychological or philosophical interpretation of that culture in order to sort of improve your own society. That's what Ruth Benedict did in Chrysanthemum and the Sword. And now we're going to learn an entirely new way to do things, because Bronislaw Malinowski ends up deciding that he does not like the Boasian approach, and that the Boasian approach is incapable of explaining how cultures change over time. Because Bronislaw Malinowski more or less invents what we're going to call the mid-century moderns, the structure function approach to culture, or looking at the institutions of a culture, the structures of a culture, and how they function within their own context. So we're going to start with this guy right here, and his name is Bronislaw Malinowski. Now, he's Polish, but he's actually born in the Empire of Austria-Hungary. And he was originally an economist. And what Malinowski wanted to do was to study the economies of non-Western people, specifically how they allocate goods and services in the absence of markets and money. Like, how do you arrange debt, or how do you owe people things, like when you have no currency or no commercial system. And what he wants to do is study these sort of exchange networks among the islander peoples of the Pacific. So in 1914, he travels to Australia for permission to spend a few months on various islands in the Pacific, studying the culture there and the exchange systems that they have. However, what happens is that while Malinowski is in Australia, the First World War breaks out in August of 1914. And Malinowski is a citizen of the Empire of Austria-Hungary. And he's in Australia, which is in part of the British Empire. So he finds himself stranded in the middle of a country that Austria-Hungary is at war with. He is promptly arrested in Australia, and he is then classified as an enemy alien. So Bronislaw Malinowski, the enemy alien of anthropology. So they don't really know what to do with Bronislaw Malinowski. He poses a bit of a conundrum for Australia. He's a traveling academic. He obviously isn't a spy. He obviously isn't, an enemy soldier. And Malinowski says, look, I've come to study the exchange systems of the islanders of the Pacific Ocean. So why don't you guys just let me do that? And the Australian officials kind of think about it, and eventually they decide that this is actually not a bad idea. So what they do is they put him on a boat, and they drop him off. I've generated this map in Google Earth. They drop him off right about where that A is. They drop him off on a place called the Trobriand Islands. And they say, look, Bronislaw Malinowski, everybody says the war is going to be over by Christmas. So what we're going to do is we're going to stick you on this island. You have to agree that you can't leave these islands. Otherwise, we actually will arrest you and put you in a prisoner of war camp. So you're going to be restricted on these islands. We're going to drop off supplies and mail every few months. So we'll check up on you. And Malinowski thinks this is an excellent idea. He'll spend a few months on these islands. He'll get to know the natives. He'll study their exchange systems. He'll study their culture. And, even if the war isn't over by Christmas, he'll still get a lot of really good research data. After all, how long can this thing go on? Bronislaw Malinowski then spends the rest of the war there, 4.5 years on these islands. And while he's there, and he is absolutely miserable almost the entire time, but while he is actually there, Bronislaw Malinowski essentially reinvents anthropological methodology. He reinterprets anthropological interpretation, and he proceeds to, the research from this stay will generate one of the great classics of cultural anthropology. That book over there on the left, The Argonauts of the Western Pacific, as he spends his time among the Trobriand Islanders. And this is the photograph right up above me. You can see, if you can't tell, Malinowski is the bald fellow in the middle wearing white. I don't know if you can tell. Malinowski just blends right in. This Polish dude just blends right into Melanesia. At any rate, while he's there, Malinowski does three main things in the 4.5 years he's stranded on the Trobriand Islands. He does those three things right there. One, he develops an entirely new methodology to studying local culture, a new methodology that will be called participant observation. You know it's important because it's in all caps. Two, he works out the political and economic system of the Trobriand Islanders, that sort of that exchange system which is not money and it's not commercial. He works out the exchange system, this political and economic institution that will be called the Kula Ring. And the third thing he does is he mounts a serious challenge to Franz Boas and the Boasians as to how they are studying culture and why you shouldn't actually interpret other cultures using philosophical and psychological methods. And we're going to deal with all three of those things, but we're only going to deal with the first one in this lecture. The other two are going to be in the next module. So Bronislaw Malinowski. Again, if you can't tell which one Malinowski is, Malinowski's the guy in white, if you can't tell. But at any rate, this is Bronislaw Malinowski. Bronislaw Malinowski engages in something called participant observation. And participant observation is a technique in which you completely immerse yourself in the studied culture. You don't do like Franz Boas said, which is you go to the natives and you sit at their feet. You are a student and they are the teacher, and they tell you all about their culture. Malinowski says this doesn't work because what people will say one thing about their culture, but they will do something completely different. What you have to do is, instead of just sort of listening to the people who tell you about their culture, you need to actually participate in that culture. And in participant observation, you both participate and observe. You essentially go native. You live with the people. You speak their language. You become not just an observer of their culture, but you participate in the acts of their culture as well, because you're trying to separate what people say about their culture from what they're actually doing about their culture. You cultivate a series of very close relationships with the people around you, and you get their feedback on how the culture operates and the research in progress. And there's nothing wrong with just going to people and saying, well, this is what you guys told me about, the Kula Ring, but this is what I'm actually seeing about the Kula Ring. And just getting their reaction about their political or economic system in operation. And that's how you actually learn about the culture. Not by just kind of passively learning it from the people, but by actively participating in the culture, at least to the extent that you can. Participant observation is a incredibly more powerful technique than the Boasian method. But it's a technique that not everyone can actually do. Participant observation is not a technique for the faint of heart. It involves a considerable commitment in time and energy. I mean, you don't have to actually go for 4.5 years on the Trobriand Islands. But you do have to spend a lot of time with the people. 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, a number of years with those people. And participant observation almost always involves a severe form of culture shock. Culture shock. What is culture shock? Culture shock is this deep sense of confusion, disorientation, and frustration that accompanies total immersion into a foreign culture. And if you ever sort of move to a completely foreign culture for a protracted period of time, you're going to experience culture shock firsthand if you haven't actually done so already. And there's up on the upper left, there's a chart that gives a rough time period as to how culture shock works. Basically, you show up in a foreign country. And for the first 2 or 3 months, like this is the honeymoon period. Everything in this foreign culture is just wonderful. Everything is amazing. The people are beautiful. The food is great. The music is amazing. These people are absolutely wonderful. But that honeymoon period ends. And roughly between about month 5 and month 8, you have this deep culture shock begins to sink in. As basically the operating system in your brain, your own internal culture, is just not finding its familiar places. It's not finding anything that's familiar, anything that it recognizes. The things that comfort you are just not there. And you have this culture shock, this incredible reaction against the culture that you're living in. Culture shock is accompanied by great amounts of stress. It's accompanied by insomnia. It's accompanied by a deep need to isolate yourself. It's accompanied by irrational behavior. And a lot of people just kind of break around month 6 or 7. They just break. They just can't take the alienness of the culture they're living in. They snap, they jump on a plane, and they fly back to where they come from. And if you do, in fact, if you're one of those people that like breaks during culture shock, this will instill in you a deep dislike and even hatred of the culture you spent so much time with, and you never really recover from it. But if you press through this, if you push through it, around month 8 or 9, you begin to adjust to the local culture. You begin to find new things to comfort yourself. And you're basically kind of reprogramming the cultural parts of your brain. You find things that are now, things that were once alien to you are becoming quite familiar. Things that were once strange and confusing are now normal. That's the adjustment period. And basically by about month 10 or 11, you have completely adapted to the native culture. You understand it. It's no big deal. You can walk down the street and nothing is really gonna freak you out. But the trick is you've got to get over that period of culture shock. And it's happened to me. In fact, this is my story of culture shock. It involves a movie theater in Guatemala City and a terrible, terrible movie. It's that Star Wars movie right there. Basically, in 2005, I was in Guatemala City. I was in Guatemala for a protracted period. I stayed in Guatemala, I think for 8 months in one unbroken stretch. But I think that entire year, I spent almost 11 months in Guatemala, most of it in Guatemala City. And I was doing a lot of lab analysis and basically living in Guatemala. And around month 4 or 5, I had a moment. I was sitting in the laboratory and I was just having a kind of little mental breakdown. I was like absolutely tired of hearing Spanish all the time. I was absolutely deeply frustrated at my inability to become fluent in the language. I was completely and totally sick of tortillas. Oh my God, tortillas. Tortillas with everything. You can order like pancakes and it'll come with a side of tortillas. Corn tortillas. I was having a moment, all right? And it was a Saturday, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to take the day off. Screw this. I don't care if I get no work done today. I'm going to take the day off. I'm going to wander into downtown Guatemala City, and I'm just going to have a nice lunch and have a lot of cool beverages and just take the afternoon off. So I went and I took the afternoon off. And while I was in this sort of big air-conditioned mall in Zone 10 of Guatemala City, I went to a movie theater. It was not that movie theater, but it was a movie theater. And I was like, you know what? I got to hear some English. I must absolutely hear some English. And what is playing in the movie theater? Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. So I walk into this movie theater. Oh, the movie theater is dark. It's air conditioned. It's nice. The theater was empty. It's almost completely empty. And it's like 1 PM. So I walk into this movie theater. I sit down in this nice comfy chair. And I'm just enjoying the air conditioning. And the movie comes on. And I watch the entire movie in English. It is not a good movie. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's not a very good movie. It's better than the Disney Star Wars, but that's not saying much. So I watched this entire movie, and as we get towards the end of the movie, I start feeling just a tremendous amount of stress. I feel a tremendous anxiety. I want to sink into the chair. You know, my stomach is upset, and I'm like, the idea of getting up, leaving this dark, air-conditioned space, you know, and all of this English, just the idea of leaving the theater, it just upset me. And the movie ends, and the lights come on, and I'm sitting in this movie theater, and I just do not want to get up and leave. I do not want to get up and leave and go outside in Guatemala City, and it's going to be hot, and there's going to be tortillas everywhere. Oh, I just can't take the tortillas. So many tortillas. And I'm just kind of making like one dumb excuse after another, like why I shouldn't get out of my chair, and I don't really want to go. I definitely don't want to go back to the laboratory. And then the lights in the theater go down, and the music starts, and the next showing of the movie comes on. All right. And I'm like, nobody noticed to kick me out of the theater. Nobody came in. I mean, the theater was still completely empty. And I watched this entire movie. I don't even like this movie. I watched this movie for a second time all the way through. And again, towards the end of the movie, I start getting anxious. I want to sink into my seat. I start feeling very nervous. And I realize I don't want to leave the theater. I don't want to leave the theater. And I did this an entire another time. So I basically watched this same movie that I do not like. I watched it 3 times in a row in Guatemala City. And halfway through the third showing of this movie, that's when I'm like, this is deeply irrational. This movie is not very good. There is no reason I would watch this movie 3 times in a row. And that's when like a little bulb went off in my head. It's like, this is culture shock. I'm in a state of profound culture shock. I'm like, okay, but now that I recognize that I'm in culture shock, I'm like, okay, this is what my undergraduate anthropology professor was talking about when they talked about culture shock. Doing weird stuff like watching a terrible movie 3 times in a row, just because I don't want to leave an air-conditioned movie theater. So I realized, okay, this is how we get it. This has got to get over culture shock. We just got to push through it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the theater. I'm going to just more or less take like the next 3 or 4 days off. I'm just going to completely blow these next like half a week off. I'm going to take a little mini vacation. I'm just going to try to like, have mental health days and just do things I enjoy and understand that this is the worst of it. And if I push through this, I can eventually get to that adjustment stage, and then I can get to the acceptance stage, and then I can work in Guatemala City for the rest of my life and not ever have to worry about that again. And I'm going to start it as soon as this movie is over. So I did actually sit all the way through the 3rd sitting. But that was my culture shock. That was me pushing through this profoundly alien experience, reprogramming cultural parts of my brain to be able to fully function in a completely different culture. And that's just modern day Guatemala City. It's not even really that alien. It's not like being stuck in a tent in the South Pacific for 4.5 years. There's Malinowski, because that's what happened to Malinowski. Malinowski experienced a profoundly depressing culture shock. He expressed a profound culture shock. And he used as a therapeutic device his journal. The entire time he stayed on the Trobriand Islands, he kept this journal where he recorded his most private fears, his most private thoughts, his private desires and feelings. And he kind of vented all of his frustrations about being stuck on this island for 4 years, about having to go through all of this profound culture shock, about having to deal with an entirely alien peoples in his journal. And he recorded, like, his journal is raw. And his journal was actually kept secret for like 40 or 50 years after he died. And it wasn't published until the 1990s. And finally, when the diaries of Bronislav Malinowski were published, they were deeply shocking. Because this great man of anthropology, this grandfather to sort of structure function anthropology, man, he says some really raw stuff in his journals. He uses really harsh language. He discusses the Trobriand Islanders in very unflattering terms. He talks about how much he hates them, how much he hates anthropology, how much he hates these islands, how he's like freaking sick of living on a beach in the Pacific, and he's sick of pork, and he's sick of seafood and pineapple all the time, and he's so sick of yams. He's very, very sick of yams. And he's profoundly miserable for the majority of the 4 years he spends on the Trobriand Islands. Yet, he pushed through it. He pushed through that third sitting of Star Wars and produced one of the best, most detailed studies of the cultural, political, and economic systems of all time, Argonauts of the Western Pacific. Argonauts of the Western Pacific is a bloody masterpiece of a book. And in that book, he pieces together how the Trobriand Islanders maintained this sort of system of economic and political balance. It avoids major conflict between the tribes. You don't have these different islands locked in incessant warfare. You don't have this sort of cycle of war and kingdom and collapse that you have in Polynesia. And the Trobriand Islanders build this incredibly complex system of alliances across 10,000 square kilometers of open ocean in the Pacific Islands. And the key to how the Trobriand Islanders function as a society, the key is something that he calls the Kula Ring. So let's meet the Trobriand Islanders and the Trobriand Islands. The Trobriand Islands are themselves, you can see the map on the upper left. They are located to the northeast of Australia itself, just to the east of New Guinea. And basically there are a series of little islands, a series of and most of them are these kind of low coral atolls. There's a sort of older, but actually probably easier to read map on the lower left. And the Trobriand Islands are those islands to the east of New Guinea. These islands are scattered across 800,000 square kilometers of ocean. I said 10,000 earlier. I was off by a factor of 80. So all these islands are scattered across 800,000 square kilometers of ocean. And mostly they're these little islands. They're these dinky little islands. The largest island is Kiriwina, which is only about 200 square kilometers. But most of these islands are really, really small. Most of these islands basically look like that. All right. And the people live on their villages in or near the coast, and the villages look like that right up above my yellow box. And it's in the tropics, it's in the Pacific, and basically there's 4 seasons to the Trobriand Islands. There's hot, and that's followed by hot and humid. That is followed by humid, and then that is followed by humid and hot. So as you see, you've got a wide variety of climates and weather systems and seasons in the Trobriand Islands. And living on those Trobriand Islands are the Trobriand Islanders. Now, the Trobriand Islanders themselves number several thousand individuals. Now, they are Melanesian, which is why they look like that. They are closely related to the inhabitants of New Guinea, but they have a lot of Polynesian elements in their culture, including their own version, and this is actually quite important, including their own version of the very famous and remarkable Polynesian sailing canoes. So even though they're an island scattered across 800,000 square kilometers of open ocean, they have the technology to travel from island to island on a regular basis. None of these islands are cut off at all. This is what the Trobriand Islanders physically look like. As you can see, they're physically very attractive people. I wish I was in as good a shape as that dude. He's in really good shape. And here are the Trobriand Islanders at one of the greeting ceremonies for the Kula Ring, which we'll meet in the next bit. And this is what they physically look like. And during the Kula Ring, when they welcome visitors from another island, they put on these elaborate displays to show off the ferocity of the men, the wealth of the village, and the beauty of the women. And it's one of the reasons they're really, really photogenic, is the really ugly people like me, they kind of keep in the back, and the really attractive ones they push in the front. Now, they live in smallish villages that are located generally right on or near the island beaches. And they subsist off a combination of yam gardening, wild fruits, pig farming, and marine resources, shellfish, mostly fishing. The villages themselves, I mean, you can see that. They live like right on the beach. The villages are basically made up of matrilineal clans, but the society itself is patrilocal. And I'll explain what all those terms mean when we get to kinship. So, but basically for now, just understand that it explains that you belong to the family of your mother, but you live in the village of your father. And this gets explained in much more detail in a tick. And they live in these sort of kin groups. So inside of a single village, you'll have different kin groups inside the village. Each of these kin groups is headed by the most prestigious male, which is called the headman or the chief. And he and his brothers generally are the leaders of each of these kin groups. Now, the problem with living on 100 scattered islands across 800 square kilometers of ocean is twofold. You've got two big problems here. One is you have to be able to maintain regular contact with the other islands in order to sort of assist each other during times of deprivation. And two, how to prevent endemic warfare between the different islands. Because if you have two islands that are widely separated that don't talk to one another, then eventually they're going to get very suspicious, and then you're going to get warfare. All right? But they don't have large-scale warfare in the Trobriand Islands. And their solution, their ingenious solution to both of these problems is to build the Kula Ring. And we'll explain exactly what the Kula Ring is next time. And I will see you there.